She was the youngest daughter of Russia's last emperor, a mischievous princess named Anastasia, born into a world of unimaginable luxury. But in 1918, her world vanished in a storm of revolution and a hail of bullets in a dark basement. For years, the official story from the Bolsheviks was murky. They announced the Tsar's execution but claimed his family was safe, sowing confusion and doubt. But then, 2 years later, a mysterious woman was pulled from a canal in Berlin. She claimed the impossible, that she was Anastasia and she had survived. This is the story of her incredible 60-year fight to prove she was the lost princess, and the scientific discovery that would finally reveal the truth behind one of history's greatest mysteries. Chapter 1. The Enchanted World. Before the whispers, before the mystery, before the blood, there was a world that seemed spun from a fairy tale. This was the world of the Romanovs, the imperial family of Russia. For 3 centuries, they had ruled a vast empire, a domain of glittering palaces and frozen wastelands. At its head was Tsar Nicholas II, a man who believed God had ordained him to rule, yet was far more comfortable with his family than in the treacherous halls of power. His wife, Tsarina Alexandra, a German princess and granddaughter of England's Queen Victoria, was beautiful and deeply religious. But her shyness and German heritage made her unpopular with the Russian people, who saw her as a cold foreign influence. Together, they had 5 children who were the center of their universe: 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and a son, Alexei, the long-awaited heir. Their lives unfolded in the gilded cage of palaces like Tsarskoye Selo. It was a world of private tutors, silk dresses, and priceless jewels. The girls, so close they called themselves Atma from their initials, were raised in a surprisingly simple way for royals. They slept on hard camp cots and took cold baths. Still, their existence was anything but normal. They were living symbols of a dynasty that seemed eternal. The youngest Grand Duchess was Anastasia. Born in 1901, she was the family's ray of sunshine and its little imp. She was famous for her boundless energy, sharp wit, and a love for pranks that tested the patience of everyone in the palace. She was a gifted mimic, a fearless tree climber, and her father's shadow. Photos from the time show a small girl with bright, inquisitive eyes and a smile that was always ready to break into laughter. But a dark shadow hung over the family: Alexei's health. He was born with hemophilia, the royal disease, passed down through Queen Victoria's line, which meant any small injury could trigger life-threatening bleeding. Desperate to save her son, the Tsarina turned to one of the most infamous figures in Russian history, Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was a Siberian peasant, a mystic who seemed to be the only one who could ease Alexei's suffering. To the Tsarina, he was a holy man. To the public, he was a debauched charlatan who had the empress under his spell. The scandalous stories swirling around Rasputin, true or not, destroyed the last shreds of respect for the monarchy. He became a symbol of the rot at the heart of the empire. This was Anastasia's world, a paradox of imperial splendor and private fear, of childhood games played against a backdrop of looming disaster. She was a princess in a dynasty that was too crumbling, a family that had lost touch with the millions it ruled. The tragedy of the Romanovs was taking shape. But in those last sun-drenched years before the storm, Anastasia was just a young girl, living inside a beautiful, fragile bubble that was about to burst. Chapter 2. The Fall. The bubble didn't just burst, it was obliterated. The first cracks appeared with Russia's humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. But the real cataclysm began in 1914. With the outbreak of World War I, Tsar Nicholas II made a disastrous decision. He took personal command of the army, leaving the capital in the hands of the deeply unpopular Tsarina and, by extension, Rasputin. The war was a meat grinder. Millions of Russian soldiers were killed. At home, the economy collapsed. Food shortages led to bread riots, and the people's suffering reached a breaking point. The Tsar, isolated at military headquarters, seemed totally oblivious. The name Romanov, once revered, was now cursed in the streets. In December 1916, a group of aristocrats, trying to save the monarchy from itself, assassinated Rasputin. They poisoned him, shot him, and threw his body into a frozen river. But his death changed nothing. The revolution was no longer a threat. It was an inevitability. In March 1917, it finally happened. The February Revolution erupted in the capital, Petrograd. Soldiers mutinied, workers went on strike, and the government lost all control. With no support left, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. 300 years of Romanov rule came to a sudden, unceremonious end. Anastasia and her siblings, all sick with the measles, were now prisoners in their own home, the Alexander Palace. The enchanted world was gone. They weren't the imperial family anymore. They were the Romanovs, private citizens. Plans to send them into exile in England fell through when Nicholas's own cousin, King George V, rescinded the offer, fearing the presence of the hated Tsar would spark an uprising in Britain. As chaos engulfed Russia, the family was moved deep into Siberia, to the town of Tobolsk. They lived in the former governor's mansion, under guard but in relative comfort. For a moment, it seemed they might just live out their days in obscurity. But history wasn't finished with them. In October 1917, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power. This was a revolution built on destroying the old world. To the Bolsheviks, the Romanovs weren't just a deposed family. They were a powerful symbol that had to be erased. As long as they were alive, they were a potential rallying cry for the anti-Bolshevik White armies, plunging the country into a brutal civil war. In the spring of 1918, the family was moved one last time to the city of Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. They were imprisoned in a merchant's house, which was given an ominous new name, the House of Special Purpose. The windows were painted over, and a high fence sealed them off from the world. Anastasia celebrated her 17th birthday there, in that suffocating atmosphere of dread, having no idea that she was living out her final weeks. Chapter 3. The Crime. The end came just after midnight on July 17, 1918. The family was awakened and told there was unrest in the town. For their own safety, they were to be moved to the basement. The Romanovs, along with their doctor and 3 loyal servants, were led down to a small, empty room. The commandant, Yakov Yurovsky, stepped forward and read a death sentence. In view of the fact that your relatives are continuing their attack on Soviet Russia, he declared, the Presidium of the Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you. Nicholas, stunned, could only stammer, "What? What?" Before Yurovsky pulled out a pistol, that was the signal. A squad of executioners rushed in. What followed wasn't a clean execution, it was chaos and butchery. The small room filled with smoke and screams. The Tsar and Tsarina died quickly. But the children did not. When the smoke cleared, the killers were horrified to see some of the Grand Duchesses were still alive. Unbeknownst to their captors, the girls had sewn family jewels into their corsets. It's believed these jewels unexpectedly deflected some of the bullets, turning what should have been a swift execution into a prolonged and gruesome slaughter. The panicked killers resorted to bayonets and rifle butts. Accounts from the murderers themselves suggest that Anastasia was one of the last to die, cornered against a wall. In about 20 minutes it was over. 11 bodies lay on the floor. The next phase of the crime was just as grim, getting rid of the evidence. The bodies were loaded onto a truck and driven to an abandoned mine shaft in the Koptuaki forest. The executioners tried to destroy the remains with acid and fire, but the task was harder than they'd thought. Realizing the mine shaft was too shallow, Yurovsky decided to move them. On the way, the truck got stuck in the mud on a desolate cart track. With time running out, they made a new plan. They would bury most of the bodies right there, under the road. To confuse anyone who might find them, they separated 2 of the bodies. Alexei and one of his sisters burned them in a separate pit and buried the charred fragments. The other 9 bodies were doused with sulfuric acid and buried in a shallow grave under the track. The killers drove their truck back and forth over the spot, hoping to hide their crime forever. For decades, they succeeded. The Bolsheviks announced that only Nicholas II had been executed, claiming his family was safe elsewhere. It was a lie designed to sow confusion. But as years passed and the family never reappeared, the world began to accept the terrible truth. Yet, in the absence of bodies, rumors of a miraculous survival began to sprout. And the name whispered most often was Anastasia. Could the family's symbol of life and energy have somehow cheated death? It seemed like pure fantasy. And then 2 years later and 1,000 miles away, a woman was pulled from a canal in Berlin, and the fantasy threatened to become real. Chapter 4. The mystery begins. On a cold evening in February 1920, A Berlin police officer pulled a young woman from the icy Landwehr Canal just after she'd thrown herself from a bridge. She carried no ID and refused to speak. She was gaunt, distressed, and covered in scars. With no name to give her, the hospital admitted her to the Dahldorf Asylum as Fräulein Unbekannt, Miss Unknown. She lived in silence for months. Then, in 1921, a fellow patient saw a magazine photo of the Russian imperial family and became convinced the mystery woman was Grand Duchess Tatiana. When shown the picture, Miss Unknown reportedly didn't react. But the patient, Clara Puthert, was persistent and started contacting Russian emigrants. Slowly, the story began to change. Someone, perhaps a nurse, perhaps another patient, looked at the same photo and wondered aloud if the woman wasn't Tatiana, but her younger sister, Anastasia. For a woman with no identity, this suggestion may have been a lifeline. The idea took root. Hesitantly at first, Miss Unknown began to hint at a royal past. By late 1921, she had a name and a story. She was Her Imperial Highness, Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna of Russia. The tale she eventually told was the stuff of nightmares and miracles. She claimed she'd only pretended to be dead in the basement. A compassionate soldier, a man she called Alexander Tchaikovsky, found her breathing among the bodies and smuggled her to safety. They traveled west, she said, and she even bore his child before he was killed in a street fight. Heartbroken, she made her way to Berlin to find her aunt, Princess Irene of Prussia, but lost her nerve at the last moment and threw herself into the canal in despair. Her story attracted a growing circle of believers, many of them Russian exiles who had lost everything. Believing in her was a way to reclaim a piece of their lost world. More influential supporters soon rallied to her cause, like Gleb Botkin, whose father, the royal doctor, had died with the Romanovs. He saw in her a living link to his own tragic past and became her fiercest advocate for the rest of his life, even coaching her on the details of court life she claimed to have forgotten. The woman, who now called herself Anna Tchaikovsky, and later Anna Anderson, was a complex figure. She somehow knew intimate details of the Romanov family's life, obscure nicknames, private jokes, the layout of the palaces. To her supporters, this was irrefutable proof. How could a simple peasant know such things? Yet there were glaring problems. She refused to speak Russian, Anastasia's native tongue, claiming the trauma had blocked it from her memory. She spoke only German, with an accent some thought was more Polish than Russian. And while she bore some resemblance to Anastasia, it was far from perfect. So, was she a traumatized princess struggling to reclaim her past, or a brilliant imposter playing the role of a lifetime? The battle to answer that question would consume her entire life. Chapter 5: The Fight for Recognition. The emergence of Anna Anderson split the Russian exile community and European nobility in two. On one side were passionate believers. On the other, a wall of skepticism from the very people who should have known Anastasia best, her own relatives. The biggest rejection came from Princess Irene of Prussia, Anastasia's aunt. After visiting Anna in the hospital, Irene declared flatly, "I saw immediately that she could not be one of my nieces." Pierre Gilliard, the children's Swiss tutor for over a decade, also met Anna and concluded she was a first-rate actress. But not Anastasia. He noted she failed a key test. She didn't seem to recognize him at all. But the most devastating blow came from Anastasia's grandmother, the Dowager Empress Marie Fyodorovna. From her exile in Denmark, the heartbroken empress refused all requests for a meeting. For Anna, this was a critical failure. If Anastasia's own grandmama wouldn't see her, how could the rest of the world believe her? Despite this, Anna's supporters were undeterred. They argued that her trauma made her behave erratically and that the relatives simply didn't want to believe. Her cause got a boost when she traveled to the United States and became a media sensation, fascinating the American public with her tragic story and aristocratic airs. Meanwhile, the opposition was digging. In 1927, Tsarina Alexandra's brother hired a private investigator who dropped a bombshell. He traced Anna's identity not to a Russian palace, but to a Polish factory. He claimed Anna Anderson was actually a missing factory worker named Franziska Shenskowska, who had a history of mental illness and had disappeared shortly before Miss Unknown was pulled from the canal. For Anna's detractors, this was the smoking gun. For her believers, it was a conspiracy, a lie fabricated by relatives who wanted to inherit the Tsar's fortune. The battle moved from public opinion to the courts. In 1938, Anna filed a lawsuit in Germany to be officially recognized as Grand Duchess Anastasia. And so began one of the longest, most tangled legal fights in German history, a case that would drag on for over 30 years. Supporters pointed to handwriting analysis and comparisons of their ear shapes. Detractors presented testimony from the Romanov relatives and the Shenkovska investigation. Anna herself was often her own worst enemy, difficult, arrogant, and prone to fits of temper. Her supporters saw it as royal disdain. Her opponents saw it as the evasiveness of a fraud. Finally, in 1970, the West German Supreme Court delivered its verdict. The court ruled that Anna Anderson had failed to provide enough proof to be declared Anastasia. But, crucially, it also ruled that her opponents had failed to prove she was not Anastasia. It was a legal stalemate. She hadn't been declared an imposter. In 1968, she married a wealthy American professor named Jack Manahan and lived out her final years with him in Charlottesville, Virginia. Anna Anderson died on February 12, 1984, at the age of 82. To the very end, she never wavered from her story. For over 60 years, she had demanded the world recognize her as the last survivor of a murdered family. She died with the mystery seemingly unresolved. But as the world debated her incredible life, science was about to have the final say. Chapter 6. The Scientific Revelation. For 70 years, the Romanovs' final resting place was a closely guarded secret. But in 1979, amateur Russian investigators, using a suppressed account from the executioner Yurovsky, found the muddy cart track in the forest and unearthed several skulls. Fearing the Soviet regime, they reburied the remains and kept their discovery secret for another decade. Then, in 1991, as the Soviet Union collapsed, the grave was officially exhumed. A team of forensic scientists began piecing together the skeletons of 9 individuals. The ultimate proof, however, would come from a revolutionary new technology: DNA analysis. To prove the remains were the Romanovs, scientists needed DNA from living relatives. They focused on mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, which is passed down from a mother to her children. Tsarina Alexandra's mtDNA line could be traced back to her grandmother, Queen Victoria, and down another family branch to Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. In a historic move, Prince Philip provided a blood sample. The mtDNA from the bones of the Empress and her 3 daughters was a perfect match. Further tests confirmed the identity of Tsar Nicholas II. The science was clear: the Romanovs had been found, but there was a problem. The grave only held 9 bodies, not 11. Tsarevich Alexei and one of his sisters were missing. This discovery breathed new life into the old myths. For supporters of Anna Anderson, this was the moment they'd been waiting for. The missing daughter, they insisted, had to be Anastasia. This is where the story takes its final, definitive turn. Anna Anderson had died years before DNA testing was common, but fate had left one last clue. During a surgery in 1979, a sample of her intestinal tissue had been removed and stored in a hospital freezer in Virginia. It was the biological equivalent of a message in a bottle. Scientists got a sample of that tissue. They extracted mtDNA from it and compared it to the confirmed Romanov DNA. The result was unequivocal. Anna Anderson's mtDNA did not match the Romanovs. Period. There was no genetic relationship. Science had delivered a single, brutal fact. Anna Anderson was not Anastasia. So if she wasn't Anastasia, who was she? The DNA held that answer too. Investigators tracked down Karl Maucher, a living descendant of Franziska Shenkovska's family. When they compared his mtDNA to that of Anna Anderson's tissue, they found a direct match. The genetic evidence proved that Anna Anderson was, in fact, Franziska Shenkovska. The imposter had been unmasked from beyond the grave. Any lingering doubt was erased in the summer of 2007. Archaeologists discovered a second, smaller burial pit near the main grave. In it, they found the charred bone fragments of a teenage boy and a young woman. DNA testing confirmed the remains belonged to 13-year-old Tsarevich Alexei and one of his sisters. While DNA can't tell Maria and Anastasia apart, it was now certain that all of the children had been found. All 11 victims were accounted for. There were no survivors. Anastasia died with her family on that horrific July night. Conclusion. So what happened when a woman claimed to be the lost Romanov princess? The world was captivated. For over 60 years, Anna Anderson fueled a mystery that spanned continents. She forced us to question identity, memory, and belief. Her story was so powerful it inspired countless books and films, including the famous animated movie that cemented a fairy tale version of Anastasia for millions. Why did so many people believe her? Perhaps because the truth, the brutal, senseless murder of an entire family, was just too horrific to accept. Believing in Anna offered a glimmer of hope in a dark story. For Russian exiles, it was a way to reclaim a piece of their shattered world. The need to believe can often be more powerful than the facts. Anna Anderson was the most convincing and the most famous of at least 10 women who claimed to be the lost Grand Duchess. In the end, science proved she was Franziska Szankowska, a troubled factory worker from Poland. Yet, even today, the romantic myth of the surviving Anastasia persists, a testament to the power of a good story. The case of Anna Anderson shows us that some mysteries become so ingrained in our culture, they take on a life of their own. If you found this look into one of history's greatest mysteries compelling, you won't want to miss our next video. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. And let us know in the comments, why do you think the Anastasia myth was, and still is, so powerful? Thanks for watching.